So good evening and welcome to our very well-lit living room at the Green Space at WNYC. I'm Josh Ginsberg. I'm the president of the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to the second Cary in the city. For those of you who don't know us, we are an independent research institute, which means we are not part of any other organization. We live in Millbrook, New York, on a 2,000-acre research forest and have been there for 35 years. The Cary Institute works at the scale of ecosystems and greater. So we like working large scale and asking questions that are important to solve or provide solutions to societal problems. We have 4 areas of expertise and many other areas where we do research. And those 4 areas are freshwater ecology and provisioning, disease ecology, particularly those diseases that move from animals to man through vectors like Lyme disease or Ebola. We work on forest ecology, and I used to say, and oddly, only temperate forest ecology, but we just hired a tropical forest ecologist who is looking at the nutrient limitations on tropical forest restoration, an area that I think we will be doing more work in because of its critical importance. And finally, tonight's talk is focusing on our 4th area, which is urban ecology. For any of you who have ever been to Millbrook, New York, you will wonder why we do urban ecology when we live and work in a very bucolic site. I think the answer is we're an international organization with a national reputation and deep local roots. So our roots are in Millbrook, but we work all over the world and particularly focus on urban ecology as a result of one of our speakers tonight. So I will lead into the introduction. Steward Pickett is a distinguished senior scientist at the Cary Institute. He's been there for many decades and really helped found the field of urban ecology. Many years ago, Steward and a colleague, Mark McDonald, got interested in how trees, particularly oak forests, grow in New York City at the Botanical Gardens, Westchester, Dutchess County, up into the Berkshires, and looked at a gradient of forests across urban to rural. And that was one of the first studies in urban ecology, and I think it's fair to say Steward was one of the first people who started thinking of cities as ecosystems, and we will talk more about that. Our second speaker tonight is Timon McPhearson. To my right. Timon is a research fellow at the Cary Institute. We're experimenting with new forms of affiliation. Timon's day job is as an associate professor and head of, I'm going to get it right, the Urban Systems Lab at the New School in New York, where there are lots of social scientists, and he is able to interact with social scientists, but we provide him a second home full of ecologists. And so it's a great thing for both of us. Timon has many other hats. He's a fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Center and also is chairing a committee at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looking at urban systems, infrastructure, and what's the third? Human settlements. Yeah. A small little set of subjects that they're going to tackle in the 6th assessment in one chapter. Tonight we're going to talk about why ecology is important for urban resilience and urban ecosystems in a time of climate change. And we have these slides which cue onto my note cards to remind me what we're talking about and to keep us moving forward. Why urban? Well, it's really obvious. Half the people in the world live in cities, and by 2050, it's going to be 60%, 70% of the human population, and that's even with a growing human population. So cities are where people live and where they will be living. And the results of climate change are particularly important to cities, in part because so many cities are coastal. And so the impacts of coastal environments through climate change, rising sea level, increased heat, water, are all particularly severe. And so this intersection between these two is important. I think the last thing to remember is that cities are the solution. They are not the problem. If we make livable cities, if we make cities work, it's going to do many things. But one of the things it will do is also help us do conservation and land restoration outside of cities. Because as people move into cities, marginal habitats, marginal agricultural lands become available for wildlife and for other uses as well. So with that, I think I've hit on most of the points I'm supposed to. Let's talk about how cities and ecology of cities can change the way that we look for durable and sustainable solutions. So I think the next slide is supposed to pop up. And, oh, there we go. I got to pop it up myself. So I would like to start by talking to Steward about the origin of urban ecology, why it's so important, and perhaps, what nature does for us in cities.
Well, those are really great questions.
Small.
And, small questions, and I will try to control myself in the answer. I just want to, just to add something to the statistics that you gave. Cities will be the home for the next 2 billion urban people, or people on the planet. Cities are our home now, and they will be even more our home. So if we're going to understand that environment and operate with that environment, we are going to need to understand them as ecological processes. It's not a matter of cities being one thing and ecology being something else out there. And that's really the most important lesson that I have for you, that cities are ecological systems. Urban ecology came out of ecology, which has as its origin a study of organisms, plants, animals, microbes, in relationship to their environments. Ecology is a science of interaction. It's one of the few sciences that is defined as a science of interaction rather than a science of stuff. And so when you take that perspective and bring it into cities, you're doing something really, really different, really new. And it's something new for cities, and it's something new for ecology. And so we've been really, really pleased to be doing that because it's been an open frontier. It's something that's changing rapidly. A lot of people have become really interested in this, recognizing that cities are really important things. Well, an ecosystem is just an interacting entity. It's an interaction between all the organisms in a place and the physical environment in that place. And that applies to cities too, but we have to add in a consideration not just of people as organisms, but people as social beings, people as political beings, power manipulators, material manipulators, waste generators, energy users. All of that is part of the ecology of cities. Now, we started out doing something that could have been called ecology in cities. So 25, 30 years ago, when ecologists were confronted with the reality that they'd been ignoring cities for about 80 years, they said, well, what's the easy thing to do? Take our toolkit and go into parks and old fields and brown fields and just do the same kind of thing we had been doing. That's what Mark McDonald and I did. And we discovered some really interesting things, some unexpected things about how those ecosystems were working. And then that made us think, well, how does that really, you can just line them up with relatively urban, relatively suburban, relatively rural or wild, and make a contrast that way. But what are the people really doing? What are the decisions? What are the influences that are moving across those boundaries? And that made us think we really need a different kind of ecology. We need an ecology that moves beyond the green spots in cities to incorporate all the spots in cities. And that we called the ecology of cities. And that was a radical new thing to do. And it's still an important thing to do. And the more and more we worked in cities and began to work with social scientists and designers, planners, ethicists and whatnot, we came to the realization, we as a group came to a realization that what we were really doing and what we really needed to do was ecology for cities, to be engaged in the processes of decision making, to understand what kinds of decisions people had to make and what sorts of ecological knowledge might benefit those decisions. So it's being engaged in the system in a new way, in a way that means that we're part of the dialogue and we're learning things that citizens, that residents, decision makers can use.
And the laboratory for that was Baltimore?
That's mainly been my laboratory for it, and the reason that we worked in Baltimore rather than continuing to work in New York City is that Baltimore is a little bit more manageable, And another, just a little bit, and another thing that was helpful to us is that Baltimore, due to some histories of highway building and highway stopping, had used the watershed concept both as a political tool and as an environmental lens, and that was very helpful to us ecologists.
And, watersheds are one aspect of the services that cities supply to their residents and that their residents often abuse. And I was wondering, Timon, can you talk more about nature-based solutions, but also how we look at ecosystem services in cities and the things that they do that are perhaps different from other natural systems?
Sure. And I kind of wanted to set up some stuff from climate too,
Okay.
but I can come back to that because I think it's really important to look at the intersection between sort of what is the role of ecosystems and sort of the role of it in terms of the way in which we deal with climate challenges.
Right.
But I also wanted to say Steward was my major professor when I was a PhD student, and so it's just a pleasure to be up here talking with you.
Same here.
Thank you
We
for
could
that.
embarrass Stewart and
Yeah.
spend most of the evening talking about his achievements, but we won't.
But so I just want to set up a little bit around climate change because I think one of the things we want to talk about here is sort of the intersection in terms of the role of ecosystems in cities, the way in which we sort of study cities as systems now, as ecosystems now, and how we sort of turn that in terms of a sort of solution framework when we're thinking about ecology for cities. And to me anyway, the climate reality, I think, and I will get to your question about
That's fine.
the nature-based solutions component.
We can integrate them. We've got
But
them
I'm going
on
to
the fly.
skip around
Okay.
a little bit. I hope that's okay. To me, I think it's important to be very realistic about our climate future. And so I don't know how many people are paying attention to sort of what's coming out in terms of the various climate projections, but you may have noticed in last couple months that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put out the 1.5 degree report, right? And the reason they do that is because the nation states, right, they respond to a call from the nation states, and they asked for that report. But if you look at the climate projections and you look at the Paris Agreement and the pledges of all the nation states to the Paris Agreement, some very good analyses are showing that we can't keep it to 1.5 degrees. And actually, all those pledges don't keep us to 2 degrees Celsius in terms of an average change on the planet. It's more likely in the 3 to 4 degree range. So I bring this up because I think it's really important for us not to be necessarily scared by that, but to be realistic about what is the challenge that we have in front of us with the sort of rapid urbanization and the way in which that interacts with the rate of change in terms of climate change on the planet and where we are now and where we seem to be headed. So I think it's important that there's all this work around, broadly we might call it mitigation, right? How we decrease our carbon footprint and how we start to bend that curve of climate change so it levels off. But I wanted to sort of start us off a little bit by thinking about what is the realism in terms of where we're headed. And to me, from looking at all the different analyses, it seems pretty clear that a lot of this is already baked in the system, right? And so if that's the case, then we're talking about resilience, which is one of the contexts for this tonight. Then we need to be thinking about who's affected and what those impacts might be. So I just want to mention a few of those as a way to kind of get us going here a little bit. One is we know that cities are already hot. Right? It's just the nature of the way in which we've developed our cities over the past, especially 200 years. And also it's sort of challenge for us in terms of how we think about developing differently, that we've been developing cities in a way that sort of squeezes out the ecology and concentrates pavement and infrastructure and sort of other heat trapping elements. And so we have a combination of temperature that's rising much more rapidly, I think, than maybe we are comfortable being realistic about, and that we need to do that if we're going to build resilience to that. But it also interacts with the nature of the sort of urban system as we've been developing it. And so what that means, and we've been modeling this a little bit in some of the work that we're doing, is that cities can be hotter at a rate, and not just a rate, but at an actual temperature that's about double the global average. So some of the stuff we've done for New York City, for example, is we've been looking at these in terms of how those global climate predictions might look at a regional scale, which a lot of work by the New York City Panel on Climate Change has done that work. When you start to look at this and how it spreads across the city, you see that some areas in the city at sort of medium level projections, not being extreme about this, are going to be in that 5 to 6 degree range Celsius. So that's basically what we might call a heat wave today is a normal day in 2070, 2080. So I set that up again, it's not a scare tactic, right? I think this is one of the challenges of talking about climate change, but it is important to be realistic about what we're facing. And of course, it's not just all about heat, right? It's also about the combination that here in New York City, we're going to talk some about New York City tonight, is that we also just happen, well, maybe not just happen, but we are in the North Atlantic in this particular place where seas are rising faster than they are in other places around the world. And so when you think about that sea level rise combined with the kinds of variability we expect in terms of precipitation, extreme precipitation, that there's actually multiple hazards we need to be building resilience to. And this is how I'm getting to the nature-based solutions point here, which is that, one, I think we need to have every tool in our toolkit to be thinking about how we deal with this. And so we want to talk a little bit about that because ecosystems are one of the sort of amazing tools that we have. And the reason is because they're very multifunctional, because they help us to cool the city and to absorb stormwater and in certain ways absorb air pollution, but they also provide all these other kinds of benefits, which you don't get from other tools in the toolkit, which we can kind of compare and contrast those a little bit. These spaces, we have these sort of side benefits that may not be directly about climate change or building resilience to climate change, but are about health. They're about mental health and physical health and the other things that ecosystems do for us. And I think this goes back to some of the work you've been working on for so long, Steward. It's about the relationship that people have with ecosystems, and we have had for our entire evolutionary history. But we've very much divorced ourselves from that in the way in which we've been developing more recently. So to me anyway, just to kind of think about the role of nature in the city and the way we connect to it, it's definitely about thinking about how we develop in a different pathway moving forward if we're actually going to take seriously the challenge of what I think the climate is telling us. And I have more to say.
Well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I think that gets into an interesting, you've sort of phrased the question from a green versus a gray versus a technological kind of solution.
Mm-hmm.
And so, why don't both of you, Steward, why don't you start? But why don't we talk a little bit about, you touched on the differences, but, why don't we talk about maybe within those four areas of flooding and storm surges and heat and water and air quality, how those systems differ and also, I think we can also later talk about the inequities and the injustice that each of those systems imposes on different parts of the community.
Well, I'll just give a start and be pretty general about it. But one of the things to remember is that green stands for things that are many other colors than just green, as long as they have ecological processes, ecological structures, the kinds of motive force that organisms, whether they're big ones or microbes, impart to a system, the kinds of transformations, the slowing down of the flow of material, which is one of the things that ecosystems do. So when you talk about green, you're talking about systems that are really doing a lot of different things at the same time. Green, blue, turquoise, wetlands, forests, marshes, oyster reefs, seagrass beds, and all sorts of things. They are doing a lot of things. Gray infrastructure, which again comes in many real colors, but metaphorically what that stands for is things that are built to perform a specific function, a specific structural role in a city. So they're much narrower, and they are judged. It's easy to say when they work and when they don't work, because they are designed to do very, very specific things. Technology, in a sense, is just an expansion of gray infrastructure, so to speak. But again, these are things that are built, designed to solve specific problems, usually engineering problems. That's how our cities have been designed. That's how almost all of us think about our cities. If you look at city charters, that's how their governments are structured. To solve specific problems, you have professionals who sign off on the designs and say, this will work. And there isn't anybody who does that for ecosystems, because they're doing they're doing more things than we think about, or most people think about. So that's one of the things that's going on. And when you combine green and gray and technological infrastructures, and I think Timon has a lot more to say about this, you've got to make some decisions. You have to know what you're getting out of each of those kinds of things, how the subtle and multifactorial ecological work in ecosystems might help you do some of that other engineered or technological work.
Well, I think you explained it very well. But maybe I'm just biased because I'm an ecologist and I've been trained by these guys. But I do think that ecosystems are really incredible, again, as a tool in our toolkit for building resilience to climate change and other kinds of challenges we have, in particular one we won't talk a lot about tonight, but public health. And that multifunctionality is exactly, I think, what you're getting at that distinguishes it from other kinds of, say, an infrastructural approach that we might call a gray infrastructure approach. So we have a number of examples of things that do this, right? So trees are like the classic example. Trees, through their shading, can cool. Through their evapotranspiration, can help cool. But trees also, do so many other things for us at the same time. When I think of, say, the fact that we're probably going to need some seawalls in New York City, maybe not next year, but if we look far enough in the future and if we have a more planning horizon about where we're headed, probably going to need them. But seawalls don't cool at the same time as they protect from coastal storm surge, right, like an ecosystem does. I think one of the great things that we're starting to learn in the way in which ecologists are partnering with designers and architects and engineers and sort of bringing a lot of these expertise together is where the potential for more hybrid infrastructures are. So green roofs are, I think, a really amazing opportunity in New York City too, that, and no offense to the people working on this right now, but we're not exactly the leader on green roofs in New York City. And if you look at most cities in Germany, if you look at the legislation that's been passed in Paris now years ago, requiring all new construction to either have solar roofs or green roofs. If you look at most of the Scandinavian cities, this has been part of the culture for a long time, and yet that's an amazing opportunity that, say, I'll just pick on Paris for an example, even though they have that legislation. In the urban core there, the tradition of the architectural style, it doesn't have all these flat roofs that we have. We have an amazing potential here in terms of the flat roof structure if we start thinking more three-dimensionally about the ecology in the city, and not just down here, but up here. And that, I think, again, coming back to the way in which it can do multiple things simultaneously, those are places that could help us get to some of the equity challenges that we're facing too in terms of where green infrastructure is. And the fact that right now, what we don't really need, I don't think, is more green roofs on high-rise luxury condos, which is where they're being built, and for good reason, because they're expensive. But what we do need, and there was a legislation, hearing on this legislation just a couple weeks ago, because New York City's finally starting to get on board here, and yeah, it's challenging. It's a complex city. It's hard to work in, so we should recognize that. But we are starting to make some progress there about how we can start to take advantage of some of the ways in which we hybridize the ecology with the built infrastructure in the city.
Well, and both of you have referred directly to the fact that ecosystems cross institutional stovepipes in city government. Mm-hmm. And so, I think it's interesting that by moving more towards green solutions, we're going to have to also restructure how we think about city planning, how we think about development of the city and the future of the city.
And that's not an easy thing to do,
yeah.
But I think after Hurricane Sandy, the city made some serious progress in that regard. And, we've got a ways to go right. Because at least, maybe this is just my own bias and the way I interpret data, everybody's biased a little bit. But I think we haven't quite gotten to where we need to in terms of the challenges that are coming next, right? But after Hurricane Sandy, there's a lot of been that work to do cross-agency collaboration around that.
And if we're going to have a Hurricane Sandy kind of situation every 5 to 7 years and 15 or 20 years, there'll be more impetus.
There's going to be more need. So the governance side of this is actually a big challenge too. Absolutely.
So we talked, you mentioned health, and I'm going to use that as a lead into the next discussion. So study in Baltimore that one of our colleagues, Shannon Ledoux, has been conducting for a number of years, looking at mosquito distributions and the inequity that the poorer neighborhoods have higher loads of mosquitoes, greater diversity of mosquitoes, more mammals, i.e. rats, that feed the mosquitoes, and then it's a serious problem, and then the interactions. As we look at vulnerable communities within New York City, how do we study and understand and mitigate the environmental injustice and the inequities of the systems that we have created over the last 150 years?
That's for you. I'll give you the hard one.
That is an important issue in so many cities, and not just New York and not just cities in the United States. This issue of equity, Where is the social housing? Where is the affordable housing, the low-rent housing? Usually it's in places that are vulnerable to some sorts of environmental hazards. This is kind of a worldwide phenomenon. And we need to operate our planning, operate our decision-making so that people aren't pushed off to vulnerable margins because they don't have a lot of money. And those are policy decisions. It's not just a matter of say, oh, well, the market drives that, and the market is this sort of innocent mechanism. There are mechanisms that can be put in place to make sure that we don't keep doing that.
Timon, can you talk a bit about the work you've done on heat in New York and the way in which poverty, race, and heat intersect?
Yeah.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I'm just thinking about, there's a combination of things that's sort of happening right now, right? So climate change is acting on top of a historical legacy of disenfranchisement, right? Racism, a number of different ways of talking about injustices. And so I think that's a challenge that is not, and the reason I said I'll give you the hard one is because that is a serious challenge. We can't sort of solve that overnight.
Right.
On the other hand, we have to make that front and center, I think, if we're going to make actual progress on that. So some of the work we've been doing to look at who's at risk, not just currently at risk, which is important, of heat now and heat waves now, which it's worth flagging, cause more deaths than all other natural hazards combined in the United States and in New York City. And this is true over the last 140 years of history that we've looked at impacts within New York City. And so on one hand, I think that's worth us worrying about a little bit because I think heat is much more about people in the way that flooding is often much more about infrastructure in terms of what are we building resilience to and who are we building it for. So the heat one, to me, is just a way to sort of really understand what this looks like. And you can see that it has been for a long time, but if you project this out in the future, it's likely to be the same unless we do something different, that it's low income and minorities that feel the brunt of this. And it's not just heat. We've also done work that we've been layering a way to look at risk to coastal flooding, inland flooding driven by precipitation, and heat waves, and you see the same thing. It's the same communities that are experiencing this. We haven't finished this work, but just some preliminary analyses from some of the students over here is showing that in environmental justice communities within New York City, 600,000 people who are a part of those environmental justice communities live below the 100-year flood line, the floodplain, the FEMA floodplain within New York City. So that's a big number. Yeah. Right? And we're a big city, so we should expect big numbers. On the other hand, I think it underlines the challenge in terms of heat and other challenges we have to face and why we're going to have to answer that question of resilience for whom. And we're going to have to target our investments that way, and I think in a way that is a much higher level of investment than we've made so far. And perhaps to underline that is this is not just for the city to do. So I don't think this gets said very much. I think it's easy to point a finger at this city, and I like to do that myself. But climate change is bigger than city governments, right? Yeah. And so we have to be thinking about how the private sector gets involved and other kinds of entities get involved in fixing this, or at least moving it in the right direction.
And Timon, you talk about the mindfulness of actually addressing this question straight on. Steward, you're doing some work in Baltimore looking at legacies that are 100, 120 years old and their current day impacts. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because as we move forward and are trying to adapt to climate change, the legacy problems of race, particularly in Baltimore, are ones that I think are relevant to trying to think forward on our planning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The topic that we're flagging in this work in Baltimore grows out of a couple of decades of work on environmental justice. We've actually unpacked that historically and mechanistically, whereas most studies of environmental justice correlate toxic or risky sites with the presence of minority or low-income communities. And that's an important body of data. But how did that come to be? And we've discovered in Baltimore that it came to be in the early part of this century. A big contributor was non-conforming zoning variances, which were through the history of Baltimore until it's shifted from being a predominantly white city to being a predominantly black city. The environmentally significant non-conforming zoning variances were almost always granted in the minority communities and refused elsewhere. So this is not an accident. It's not just a correlation. And so that's been an important thing. One of the other things that we're doing is looking at the details of redlining. Redlining is, if maybe, is that where we?
There we go.
Yeah, there's a map of redlining. You can get, there were about 200 cities in the United States that were redlined or classified for mortgage worthiness by neighborhood, by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation. Now, who do you point the finger at? Okay, that's a federal program. It's the evil, racist feds. Well, they hired local people to be the assessors and to bring their knowledge and their biases into the evaluations. And you see a little, in that red square there, you see some of the ways in which they described neighborhoods, or what you graded a neighborhood D if the houses were old and small, if there were black folks there, if there were immigrants there, if there were Jews there, it was just, this stuff hurts to read. It hurts to read. And that continues to have an influence today. These are the neighborhoods, the red line neighborhoods in Baltimore, the ones without trees. The red line neighborhoods are the ones in Baltimore where in the housing, in the last bubble, the last recession, the predatory lending was concentrated. This just is still with us. It's not something that was done in the 1930s and is over. And so we need to unpack this, we need data on this, and we need to understand this isn't just a social problem, it's also an ecological problem.
And as we look forward at green infrastructure, particularly solutions, second half of this slide, there are equally challenging issues related to equity and racial discrimination.
Absolutely. There are real fears and, in many cases, demonstrations of gentrification that follow on greening. And that's a problem. Now, how do you take care of that? Well, again, that is something where incentives and the sort of manipulation of power relationships can be dealt with. Yeah. Even without actual, say, change in ownership or occupancy, this fear of gentrification is something that sometimes limits the uptake of green infrastructure by minority and low-income communities. They don't want to lose, they don't want to be thrown out, so they don't want trees. They don't want the little things that some planner who lives in some nameless suburban development, I won't accuse any, but, says this is a good thing, it's beautiful.
You have someone in mind?
No, I don't. I don't. But okay. So there are many dimensions of this, and that's part of what we have to deal with.
And not just in Baltimore, in New York too.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And just what you're talking just made me think of an example of, and I will kind of name names, but not because it's so bad. It's just because it's something like we're learning in terms of these unintended consequences, which we've put a lot of effort into planting trees in New York City, right? So many of you probably remember the Million Trees campaign, which only just ended a few years ago. And we're going to plant some more trees as part of the Cool Neighborhoods program to again, bring in the benefits of nature as part of a way to cool the city. But one of the things we learned early on in that program is that not all areas of the city want them. And we didn't really know that. And by we, I mean, a large group of people were thinking about how do you prioritize where to put these trees. And, there was, I think, some very good intentions of the early stages of that project were what they called trees for public health, right? So you looked at the areas that had high asthma rates, areas where there's high air pollution, and well, that seems like a perfect place to put a tree. But then realize that people have different ideas about what they want on their streets and in their neighborhoods. Yeah. And so if we're not, and anyone involved in this isn't directly engaged in the community, understanding those values, then you can easily make wrong decisions. And in this case, trees got cut down You plant a tree, put a lot of effort into it, and you come back a week later and it's gone.
Right.
And it's gone for a good reason. It's because you're taking up their play space, and trees are places in New York that garbage collects, and garbage brings in rats. And so it's actually, if you start to understand it, it's completely understandable that you'd want to reject that. And that's not even about gentrification yet, right? These are just like everyday, reasonable kinds of decisions about why this tree might be a bad thing, when all of our studies are showing that it can increase real estate value by 15%, which seems very good, right? And so I think there's something that we don't, at least I don't think we have the answer to yet.
Right.
But there's certainly a complexity to dig into and to go in there a bit cautiously in terms of where we want to sort of tailor solutions, and who are we tailoring them for, and how are they involved in that decision-making process.
And so cities are socio-ecological structures. And so part of the challenge for ecologists is we're not trained as sociologists. And so we think trees are good, right? Just as a general principle. I think many people think trees are good. But this,
I like trees.
Yeah, I like trees. But this relationship between the people and their environment is, I think, one of the things in urban ecology that's different. Right? We, even those of us who work in more remote areas, understand the relationship between the way in which people live in those environments, but the way in which people drive them and own them and determine the outcomes of what are good intentions with bad results is clearly a challenge. So, it's really important. We're going to leave some time for questions. So I think it's always important to sort of at least end this part of the discussion with an up note, right? So given that we're going to be flooded, it's going to be really hot, there's huge social injustice and inequity, what do we do, right? So a couple observations on things that actually make you feel there is hope and there is a future that is better and one that is adapted to the changes we're seeing.
You first.
Well, I think there's something we started off at the beginning talking about, which is sort of the role of nature, because it's so multifunctional and providing a lot of benefits. So, yes, we've got to deal with the fact that it can drive gentrification, so we need to be very careful about how it's paired with other kinds of strategies, right? So we have to pair it with providing low-income and affordable housing for low-income residents. We have to pair it with other kinds of strategies. On the other hand, it's an amazing opportunity for us to bring a major toolkit into the urban space that we have been pushing out for, I think, too long. And there's other benefits besides just sort of the direct, say, carbon absorption or water absorption or heat reduction benefits. It's also about the way in which we engage with nature and the way in which we sort of think about what is our role on this planet and how do we think of our future. And I think there's plenty of studies to show that nature changes your brain. It changes the way we think about things. And if we don't have that in the city, if people are not growing up with that, then they're not growing up with a way of sort of appreciating the value of that, with a conservation ethic, which is a way of thinking about the planet at a different scale. So I think there's some amazing work to do, and there's a lot of really good things that are happening. I think that just the fact that we had a hearing on whether or not to require green roofs on new construction as part of a new legislative goal here in the city is amazing. We've been waiting for it, and it's coming. Some of the work that the city and local neighborhoods and nonprofits and the foundations behind them have done to support ecological restoration, from the wetlands for coastal protection to forest restoration to street trees in these very hot parts of the city. These are, I think, some amazing successes we have, and there's a reason that other cities look to New York as an example for some of this. And yet, we don't want to oversimplify it. There's some complexities we still got to work out.
One of the things that's fundamental to these kinds of changes is deep dialogue. You asked, how can ecologists approach these problems? Well, we don't approach these problems by ourselves. We must approach these problems with other kinds of sciences, other kinds of scholars, even with people in the humanities and arts, for goodness sakes. That's a good thing, right? And we also need to be engaged in dialogue with the people who officially make decisions, the various levels of government. We just need to be engaged in dialogue, but maybe even more important, we need to be engaged in dialogue with regular folks, residents in our cities, so that we don't have the surprises of people cutting down trees that somebody thought were good. So we just need deep dialogue. We need to have a new community of people that envision the city differently and envision the city ecologically. That's a big job.
Okay. So we're not going to read this because you guys all know how to read, but we'll leave that up there. I'd like to leave, we've got about 15 minutes left in our scheduled time, and I'd like to open it up for questions because I have done enough of these to know that some of the best discussion happens from questions. Gentleman in the front here.
We talked about planting trees, but what about dying trees? I just wonder, I work for New York City and I know what it costs to plant a street tree, and I know that many of our forests in the poorest neighborhoods are being eaten up by the invasive vines. Does that figure into your thinking?
So since we don't have a mic, the question was, how do we look at dying trees and the factors that are driving them and other sort of negative effects of invasive vines, invasive pests and pathogens, whether it's ash borer or a vine choking out a tree?
One of the hardest things to be is an urban tree. If
It's a song, I think, somewhere, isn't it?
if one is a tree in a forest outside, this sounds like the Wizard of Oz, but at any rate, if in a forest you expect about 1% mortality per year of trees. In a city, you expect like 4 to 6%, and that's trees that are treated well. So it's hard to be a tree in a city, and we have to recognize that there has to be management as a result of that. And then the other issue of the impairment of forest regeneration by especially vines, a lot of introduced invasive vines, but some of our local vines also can be problematic if you open a forest intensively and there's a lot of light. So there's management that's involved. And one of the things that we tend to forget is that you don't just plant a tree and leave it alone. You have to manage forests. You have to manage woodland stands.
Can I add real quick to that? There's a lot of work on that management, right? And so whether it's the Parks Department or it's nonprofit groups, they're all trying to work on this. But this is a serious challenge, actually. And to me, it raises the bigger question, which is, what is the larger picture that New York City sits inside, right? And so, again, coming back to climate change is shifting what species do well in what environments. And so if we're thinking forward, it's not just plant trees or whatever the vegetation or ecological species that we want to sort of focus on. It's which ones can survive here best, not just now, but in the future, right? And so there's having that in mind and really starting to sort of shift our planting palette, which also means shifting some of our values about what trees we're in love with, and they may not be the right ones anymore. But it also means that management, which to me comes back also to this sort of question of how do we get more people involved in that? Because it's expensive to maintain trees. I mean, you mentioned the cost of what a contractor charges to put in a street tree, but that management is not the kind of thing we tend to fund, right? And so it's really important for us to motivate those funds, but I think it's also about the broader public becoming part of the sort of caretakers and the stewards of our urban environment.
Yeah, and the urban trees account for about a third of the cost or the impact of foreign pests and pathogens, so rusts and boring beetles and things. We see them in cities first because they come in through ports, and cities are around ports. But if you look at the economic cost of those, about $3 billion a year. About $1 billion of that is in urban forests. $2 billion of it is in the rest of the forest, and much larger forests. So again, not only is it more expensive to plant them, but you can lose. I mean, some cities that had only ash or only elm have lost all their trees in one swell swoop, and that's not good. Question in the back over here. If the mic's on, otherwise speak loudly and we'll repeat the question.
In your remarks, Mr. McPhearson, you talked about ecological systems being more multifactorial and having that as an advantage over great infrastructure. But obviously, there are many ecological systems. And how do you evaluate which ecological systems make sense in any particular problem that a given city might be facing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I assume, did everybody hear that okay?
Just repeat it.
Okay, I'll repeat it real fast. How do you evaluate which ecosystems are sort of best suited to the problem? if I put it sort of briefly. I think there's a lot of knowledge already about what ecosystems do, and this is going back to sort of the roots of not just urban ecology, but our knowledge over the last 150, 200 years of studying forests and studying wetlands and understanding their functions. So now we're thinking about how do we turn those functions into benefits for a particular targeted challenge. So we actually know quite a bit. That's not to say that we know it all, but I think we have quite a good understanding of the ability of wetlands to purify water, and the ability of say, larger vegetation like trees are better at cooling than, say, grass. So because they have the ability to shade and provide a larger area for evapotranspiration. So some of these things are things that we've kind of known ecologically for a while. But I take your point that maybe it's a little more complex depending on exactly what we're working on. And so there, if we're actually targeting a solution in a particular location, in some cases there's still more research to be done, and we've got some experimentation to do. And just maybe that's a little plug for funding research. I don't know.
Hi. I was wondering, when you were discussing like the unexpected outcomes of gentrification due to these different like urban green, these urban resiliency infrastructure efforts, could it be that there's like almost like a fetishization of this like green infrastructure, and that like due to like its rarity and its popularity amongst like the gentrifying class, the creative class, that like if green infrastructure was to become more normalized, more universal, that there would be like it would become less of a magnet for this like inequitable type of economic development in these inner city areas?
Wow, that sounds like pretty heavy social science. I think that there's a lot in what you say, that we have to stop thinking about green infrastructure as this totalized thing, this universal good, because there are different reasons that you would use it, and there are different reasons that you would use different kinds of it, and there are different reasons why you might not use it sometimes. And again, I keep going back to the sort of civic process of having a dialogue that makes sure that the perspectives of all sorts of folks of various degrees of power and wealth and so on are engaged, so that the pluses and minuses on multiple dimensions are exposed before the decisions are made by the green fetishists.
My name is Verena Rauchenwald. I work for a company in Brooklyn. It's called Agritecture, and we are a boutique consultancy that does consulting work on urban agriculture all around the world and in different climates. And so, because of that focus, we do advice on community gardens, on vertical farms, on greenhouses. I was hoping actually to hear urban farming as something, urban agriculture as something of the urban resilience concept or urban ecology concept. Based on the gray and green areas, I would divide actually, for example, community gardens based on soil into the green section, while controlled environmental agriculture like vertical farms and such I would maybe put into the gray area. So I'm curious if you would agree, disagree. Also, if urban farming has become already part of the dialogue on urban ecology, and then also if you with the changing climate, if you see that controlled environmental agriculture will have to play a part in the future. Thank you.
That's a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions.
Can I jump in on the first couple
But
ones?
thank you for bringing in a whole new subject.
No, it's great. And we haven't mentioned urban agriculture. In my brain, it sort of pops up automatically when I think about green roofs as one of the sort of opportunity spaces for expanding agriculture in the city. And maybe we haven't talked about it too much because we've been focusing a little bit around sort of the climate challenge, and there's other challenges like food security. But I will say that I think there is an amazing opportunity for really expanding urban agriculture. I think ultimately, when you start to add up the amount of food that New Yorkers need on a daily basis, it's never going to be more than a small percentage, but that percentage can be a very important percentage of food security, nutrition, and local produce and things like that. On the climate side, there's actually some interesting work yet to be done, because if we just take sort of one metric in New York, which is there's money to spend on green infrastructure for stormwater absorption, right? this is an important priority within New York City. It's not just true in New York City. This is true across a lot of cities that have this sort of combined sewage overflow systems that we have. And we haven't done as much work to really understand how agriculture systems can be part of that stormwater retention. And so there's some of this work has been done in other areas. We've done some work on community gardens and how community gardens can be part of that, specifically to be able to advocate for why various kinds of urban agriculture, from rooftop farming to community gardens on the normal level, should be part of the investments that we make for stormwater absorption alone, let alone all the other benefits that come along with it, which I'll just throw out, which is for another conversation, I think are beyond food and are much more about the opportunities that people have to engage with each other in growing food and what that does to us as urban residents.
Yeah, just quickly on the urban agriculture thing, there's a real opportunity in some of our cities where there's a turnover of land. Baltimore is a great case. And again, you want to be a little careful. I'm going to play a little bit on the equity caution that don't assume that people whose grandparents left the South to get away from sharecropping are anxious to become farmers.
Other questions? Oh, we have one right here with
Hi,
Mike,
yeah.
and then a
Get
Mike
some
maybe
neck
back there.
exercise. I was thinking in the response to the question from the person in the back there about kind of the complexity of ecosystems and the variety of ecosystems, and you mentioned wetlands as an example and how they have a particular or many particular roles. But do we think of the city itself as ecosystem, or are we talking about a lot of different ecosystems, and I imagine that the idea of novel ecosystems also comes up, and does the scale of these ecosystems work differently in a city context than it does in the traditional ecology context?
There's a lot there. I'm going to take a crack at that. The ecosystem concept is highly generalizable and can be applied at almost any spatial scale. And the issues are when you draw the boundary, which you must when you establish an ecosystem model, you have to figure out what's coming and going across the boundary. So, yes, an urban area is a social ecological system. An urban area is an ecosystem. Yes, an urban farm is an ecosystem. A vacant lot is an ecosystem. So the concept can apply at any scale and be operationalized in many, many different ways. So it's something that we haven't necessarily been careful with, and I admit that. But I find it valuable for many purposes to think about the city as an ecosystem, or the urban area as an ecosystem, a social, ecological, technical system, which contains other ecosystems. Okay, it's a hierarchical, a nested kind of idea. Does that help?
And therefore, its relationship to, quote, natural, end quote, ecosystems depends on the scale of the natural ecosystem or the urban, and you could have urban ecosystems that are bigger and natural ones that are smaller.
Yeah, size doesn't have a whole lot to do with
Size,
it.
yeah.
There's an ecosystem right here.
Yeah.
So,
I've been thinking a lot about urban rooftop solar and the spread of urban rooftop solar. And then during your talk, it occurred to me that, as compared to green roofs, solar panels may be neutral or even negative with respect to heat retention and stormwater, or the effects of stormwater. But I didn't really hear you talk about PV panels at all. I just heard you talk about green roofs. So
it's because you're talking to a bunch of ecologists.
Well, that's fair. I guess my question for you is are you into urban rooftop solar? And two, do you know if there's been any sort of research or modeling into what the appropriate or ideal mix of green roofs and rooftop solar would be? Because I assume that they're competing for real estate, right?
They are competing for real estate, and there has been work done on it. I don't know about any work in New York and I could be missing something that's looked specifically at the competition for space and sort of what is the right mix. But there's quite a bit of work to look at how you can bring them together. And so this is kind of a new area of research, is to do both, right? And to think about the way in which you place rooftop solar so that You can have, and this depends on what you want to plant, right? So if you're thinking about urban farms, on top of that, you're going to be very limited in what you can grow because you are going to have some shading from the solar PV, but you can also build under that, especially with sedum and other kinds of plants, if you keep it kind of simple in terms of your green roof mix, that you can do the other kinds of capture where you have the soil depth of whatever it is, 4 or 6 inches, that can hold onto that stormwater, and you can put PV on top of that. And so I think there's ways to limit that competition, but certainly there is some study. So there was a study done at CUNY a few years ago now. I don't know, maybe 2012, 2013, I forget, that was looking at the potential for solar on rooftop solar in New York City, and did an estimate of, and sort of, to some extent, kind of a back envelope calculation, but it's a reasonable one in terms of how much total area is there for solar PV, and what is the potential in terms of the amount of energy that could be produced locally. So happy to share that with you if you can't find it.
Here in the back, I'd like to add in some awesome science, was that if you put solar PV on a green roof, it cools the solar panels because of the cooling effect. And that actually makes solar panels up to 20% more efficient at generating electricity. So it's not only, I wouldn't call it a competition, I'd say they collaborate well together.
Nice.
And the second thing that just came to mind in a really crazy way for me was urban agriculture as a way to monetize a benefit from green infrastructure. I can't think of any other green infrastructure investment that you could actually look at as a business model, as saying, I want to have long-term business derived from investing in green infrastructure in urban areas. And I think that's a really cool way to think about an economic, we're inescapably in an economic system. And it doesn't always have to be, oh, let's switch from gray to green infrastructure, but imagining green infrastructure also being able to provide economic co-benefits is pretty awesome.
Certainly, and rooftop agriculture is taking advantage of that. And I think you're right. I'll just add one caveat, which is farming is still hard. And the profit margins are still low. And so if you want to have sort of diverse produce, and I know this because I've been working closely with some of the rooftop agriculture people here in New York City, if you want to do anything beyond sort of microgreens that you can sell to high-end restaurants, you have to be comfortable with low profit margins. And so you're right. There's a way to make a business case, and people are, and they're building businesses around it. But you have to be willing to sort of do the hard work of being a farmer with low profit margins and all the work involved.
Totally. I'd just say that you can actually make maybe some of the cost of your maintenance back running an urban farm on a rooftop versus just investing in green infrastructure that's just maintenance.
Yep. Thank you.
One more question, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I had a question about the ecology impact of planting sedum. I designed green roofs and living walls, and about planting sedum in a place that it really isn't necessarily existing originally. Does this affect the ecology of the city, like in a negative way at all, by replacing native plants? Not to say that people aren't doing that, but I think majorities are not planting natives that are, coming into this green infrastructure, and also the fertilization of these rooftops going into our water is also kind of concerning. I don't know.
I'm loving talking about this, and I don't think any of my green roof ecology students are here today. Is everyone? There she is. Okay, because I teach a class on green roof ecology. And so anyway, just straight to, and I know I gotta be fast, straight to your question. There's a couple things going on, and so I don't think it's necessarily a simple answer. So let's just take the example of the Javits Center green roof, which is, I don't know now whether it at one point it was like the largest green roof in the world, and it's still a very large one for New York City. It's a sedum roof, right? That's where right now the best research is happening, and partly because Javits has been supporting that, and other foundations have been supporting that research as a place to really look at the ecological impact of sedum roofs. And also large roofs. And so we're finding that it's nesting habitat for birds. The insects it's an incredible place for insects. It's not so great for pollinators. It's not so great for some other species. However, it's new space. So there's sort of pros and cons to think about there. Is it's new ecological space, so it goes back to novel ecosystems where we're sort of building something that's never really existed before. So that's kind of an interesting experiment that we're doing, and we don't necessarily know all the ecological impacts yet, but we do know we're creating new habitat when we do that for some species and not others. So there's a selection effect that's happening there, and we definitely need to study that more.
So do you want to jump in?
Just quickly, given
Please.
sedum's natural history, I would not expect it to become a problem outside of green roofs.
So I'm going to just jump in and thank you all for coming. Number one, this is new for us. We are trying to expand our footprint a little bit. You may have heard us on WNYC as a sponsor, and we are grateful for that. They've been great for us, and I hope we've been good to them. We are a private, nonprofit research institute, so it is my job as president to remind all of you that your contributions are always welcome. There are members of the audience who are already supporters of ours, and I'm grateful for that. I also want to thank our sponsors tonight because they've helped defray the cost of this. We really love the audience here. Our audience, this is sort of an approach we've done in Millbrook. We have Friday nights at the Cary once a month, but that audience is both older and an audience that we've known a long time. So I really appreciate you all coming. Tell your friends. What my goal is tonight, we had 60 on the wait list. My goal is that next year when we do this, we'll have to find a bigger space. So please let your friends know. If you want to know more about the Cary Institute, just ask anybody with one of these on or one of these Got Ecology buttons or come up to us afterwards. Have a wonderful night, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Steward and Timon, for a great talk.